Buddy, what's up? Welcome back for another weekly coaching stream with myself, Matt Hunt. I hope everybody is doing well this week, and I hope you've all enjoyed some of the exercises that we've been doing with the trainer drills. Our weekly challenges are moving into a new week, obviously a new block of challenges as well. We've got a completely different theme this month. We're going through, instead of looking at dynamic flop textures like we were last time, we are now going to be looking at a certain portion of our range. So we're kind of shifting how we are looking at these drills. We're shifting how we're choosing what drills we're doing. And we're in particular going to be able to really focus in on different hands, different parts of our range here in this new set of drills. And one of the ways we're going to be doing that is we're going to start with a focus on the top of our range. So we're going to start with a overall perspective of the hands that are at the top of our range pre-flop, and then of course going into post-flop as well. So what we're going to do today is set up some drills that give us the opportunity to talk through some of the basic ideas and protocols that we're going to use and put in place when we're trying to figure out what incentives the strongest hands in our range are going to have. So we're going to dive into some trainer exercises, as we always do, and I'm going to create a drill right here. I am going to stick with complete hand for now. We're going to go complete hand, 60 big blinds. We're going to go different positions. So we're just going to see what comes up. We're just going to let the trainer deal us a few spots here. And in terms of hand configuration, we're going to go over here to ranges, and we're going to look at the top 25% of the pre-flop range by equity. So in any given spot, this is going to allow us to look at basically the strong hands and figure out where the strong hands incentives are and how we're going to be playing them. Now we may tighten this up to even top 10%, top 15%. You know what? I'm going to go top 15%. So we're going to go 85% up to 100% of our pre-flop range. And then we're going to hit save and train. Now I do have I have my Chrome app enabled that hides my hole cards. So let's get rid of that because we don't want to do things with hidden hole cards just yet. But we will probably experiment with that later on at some point in a future session. So that's an interesting one that we'll come back to at some stage. But we've got pocket kings this first hand, so this is a pretty trivial raise. Not really too much to talk about there. And now we have to kind of evaluate where we're at. Right now we actually have a decision to make, because I think this type of situation where we get 3-bet by the small blind, we're in position, I think players are quite prone to misplaying these types of situations, and this is exactly one of the reasons why I thought that focusing on playing the top of our range would be an important thing to look at this time. So if we think about the scenario that we're in, we've opened early position, we're facing a small blind 3-bet. The first thing to note here is that when we get 3-bet by players in the blinds, largely we are getting 3-bet by at least some kind of a polar range, right? There's some element of polarity to that 3-bet range. And what that means is that there's not going to be that many hands in this range that have a particularly tough decision against a 4-bet, especially when we consider that the sizes that we have on offer. We obviously have just kind of a click back, a very small size at 20 bigs, and then a shove, right? The shove is quite a lot. We're shoving 60 bigs into 13.5. It's not too much a shove, but it is quite a big shove. And then the small click back, we're giving villain a very good price here, but like I say, there is some element of polarity to that range, which means that they're going to have a lot of fairly trivial folds. So in the end here, we're actually going to see in spots like this, there's probably going to be very, very limited small 4-betting, which is an important kind of aspect to this spot. And we're also going to see a surprising amount of trapping. We're going to see quite a bit of calling with some pretty strong hands here. The reasoning behind that being that when we're in position post-flop facing a 3-bet, the ability to play in position, the opportunity to over-realize our equity by flatting and going to a flop there, it is very powerful. It's especially pretty powerful in comparison to the fact that when we shove pre, obviously we get a fold from a lot of hands, and there's only a small region of hands that if we shove can actually call off with worse here. Villain is going to be 3-betting jacks and queens at high frequencies here, but hands like 10s are not going to be pure 3-bets. 9s is not going to 3-bet very much. So there's really not that many hands. I mean, ace king is obviously in there, but there's not that many hands when we specifically have 2 kings in our hand that are actually able to call off here if we were to shove. So my inclination is that we're probably in a position where, even though kings might mix some shoves here, it would not shock me at all if we just play pure call. So we're going to hit the call button. And let's see. Yeah, okay, so we're playing almost pure call here, right? We do have a bit of jamming with queens and ace king off. There's a tiny bit of jamming with kings, tiny bit of jamming with jacks. So very, very low frequency of shoves here pre-flop. We have no small 4-bets at all. So we don't do any clicking back here. And we're just basically playing a lot of call or fold. And aces and kings are doing a lot of trapping here. Now, if you guys are doing the challenges this week and you have run into a few of these spots, it wouldn't shock me at all to hear that you guys are getting into some situations where you're maybe not finding some of the traps or not finding some of the calls in these spots that the solver wants to find. So do let me know in the chat if that's something you've run into doing the challenges this week. It is a common thing, and it's worthwhile to put some energy into, figuring out how to kind of get a clear sense of where we're going to be trapping in some of these spots. So we do trap with the kings. We flat because that range is pretty polar in the small blind. And then we get queen 7-5 rainbow, and we face this 10 big blind bet here, right? So we face a half pot size. Now, the half pot size on this board is going to put some of our pocket pairs in a tricky spot. So it is a pretty reasonable size from the small blind here. And we have to now decide, do we have much incentive to raise with kings, or do we want to just call? Now, in terms of raise sizings, the only size options we have are 24 and all in. 24 is about half our stack, and it's incredibly difficult for us to ever bluff if we raise to half of our stack here. So I would imagine the 24 size is probably almost never going to be used here. The all-in size could be used, but normally the all-in size is going to be used in situations where some of our value hands might be a little bit more vulnerable, right? Where the top of our range is going to be a little bit more inclined to perhaps deny some equity, want to get the money in now instead of waiting till later streets. And in this particular spot, that doesn't really apply because the top of our range on this board, which is going to be basically sets and aces and kings, it's not really very vulnerable at all, right? So I would imagine we probably don't play very many raises here at all. I imagine we probably play pretty close to call or fold. And that's relatively common in 3-bet pots when we're facing this kind of half pot size. So we're just going to hit call. And yeah, we basically are playing call or fold here. There's a tiny bit of some of that small raising going on with a few combos here, but it's not significant enough to actually be a well-rounded strategy. It's just kind of a little bit of noise there in the sim. So all in all, we trap pre, we trap the flop, or we call the flop. Everything seems very normal, very logical so far. And then we get this 5 of spades turn. So as far as how we're evaluating this turn card, the thing about this is that it is a turn card that for the very top of our range, it's a very good turn card because we now have full houses. We now have overpairs that have 2-pair and are even stronger than they previously were. So we're in a lot of really good spots here. We're in a very good position. And I think the mistake that players tend to make here when we're at this low SPR and we've got about a 1 SPR left is they tend to err on the side of just, because the SPR is 1, they just play shove or check, right? And that tends to be a bit of an error in some spots because there are very, very few hands that the small blind would have here that would have a tough decision against a shove. And in fact, the small bet is likely to put a lot of the hands in the small blind's range in some pretty tricky situations. So I would guess that the most common size here is probably the 10 big blind size. The 10% size, the 4 big blind size is probably a bit less common. The 20 is a bit big. I think in a perfect world here, if we had every possible bet size available, I would like a bet size somewhere in the 2E region, which would be about 13 or 14 bigs or something like that. But I do think it's completely reasonable to stick with the 10 here. And I don't think kings is in the category where it wants to check back again here. I think we have to start putting a little bit of money in, get a bit more value from like jacks, 10s, that sort of stuff. So I think we're going to bet 10. And let's see. Yep, okay. So 10 is good. This is the size that we're preferring with most of our strong hands here with our value range. Kings is a pure bet in this case. We are trapping a lot with the top, with queens, with sevens, quad fives, and there's a little bit of the 10% coming in here, but we're generally favoring small. We're not really going with the 20 big blind bet. The half pot is too big here, leaves too low of an SPR on the river. So the small bet seems very reasonable here. And then we have half pot behind. Villain checks the river on a 3 of clubs. And this, I think, is just a pretty trivial shove. We don't really have any other bet size that we need to use here. We don't have any other bet size that we really can use. And our hand is clearly strong enough to shove for value. So we pretty much nailed that one. I mean, I don't want to blow my own horn too much, but we got 5 out of 5 there. So that one is a good start for us here. We did, play that one pretty well all around. Now, I noticed we've got a few people out there in the chat. Welcome, everybody. Hope everybody is doing well this week. Normally takes until about 10:15 before we get a few people in here. So happy to see you guys showing up this week. And if you are out there in the chat, make sure you hit the like button. Make sure that we get all of those likes coming in just so that we can promote the channel and make sure that this video reaches as many people as possible. So we're going to move on to the next hand, and this time we have jacks. So obviously, again, pretty high up in our pre-flop range, but not the nuts in the way that kings or aces would be. We do open from the U7 position. Thank you for everybody for dropping likes in the chat. I can see that right there, so that's awesome. And we get flattered by the cutoff here. So we go for the 2.3 open. We get flattered by cutoff. We then have ace 5-5 as the flop. Now, these types of spots are really tricky, right? I think everybody kind of finds these spots a little bit awkward because of the fact that we're out of position as the pre-flop raiser. We have a good pocket pair here, but obviously an ace flopped. Now, I think the first starting point that we have to keep in mind here is what our overall flop strategy is going to look like. Are we going to be taking a strategy of small bet at a high frequency? Are we going to be going with big bet or check? There's a variety of different strategies that are available to us. And I think largely on a board like this, the basic parameter here is going to be that the cutoff has a lot of pocket pairs. So on a board like this, those pocket pairs are not going to be in bad shape. Like, we're not really going to be able to put them in any kind of tough spot by betting here. Even if we bet 66%, they're not going to fold at any significant rate, I wouldn't think. So I think it comes down to, the portion of range that we can put under a little bit of pressure is going to be some of those Broadway hands. So I wouldn't be surprised here to see a decent frequency of small betting. I think in terms of the strategy that I myself would implement here, I think small bet is most likely what I would go with. You do occasionally see some big bet or check strategies on some of these ace high boards in out of position lines like this, but I'm a little bit more inclined to veer towards small bet, and I think this hand functions okay through that line. So yeah, okay, so we got small bet or check here. Tiny bit of big bet, but not really a lot, not enough that it really makes that much difference. So we do bet small and get called. Naturally, we're able to get called by plenty of worse hands here. We did expect to get value from those pocket pairs, so completely reasonable that we would bet small and still be in good shape after we do get called. But then the turn is the king of spades. Now, this is obviously a turn card that is pretty bad for our exact hand, because hands that might have called the flop with something like king queen suited, king queen with a backdoor, king x backdoor type hands, they just improved. And of course, the other aspect here in which this hand is, or this card is slightly bad for us, is that it's no longer really particularly feasible for our opponent to ever put money in the pot or more money in the pot with a worse pocket pair. we can't really expect a hand like 10s, 9s, 8s, 7s, 6s to put any more money in the pot at all here. So definitely not a good card, but it's also very relevant that our hand still has plenty of showdown value. We don't really have any reason to start turning this hand into any kind of a bluff. We don't really have any ability to get value, so I would imagine this hand just plays pure check here. Oh, okay, not quite pure check. So high frequency check, but not quite pure. That is a little bit surprising. I'm a little bit curious that there's so much small betting here. It's a very interesting spot. It could simply be that those pocket pairs do have kind of a tricky decision against that small bet. It looks like the small bet is kind of driven by, yeah, we are actually value betting some King X there on the turn. So that's quite interesting. Did not expect to see that. There's also some overbetting there. So small or overbet is kind of the route that we're going there. But Jacks is high frequency check. And then it goes check, check, and river comes a 10. Now, as far as villain's overall range at this point, obviously a straight did get there, but that's a very, very low frequency hand for villain to have, especially considering that we have 2 jacks in our hand. I don't imagine that this is that bad of a card overall, considering that it did go check, check on the turn. Villain does have a king sometimes, but you know, there's not really any hand that improved to beat us here, other than specifically maybe Queen Jack of Spades that can be there at some frequency, Queen Jack of Diamonds possibly. Pocket 10s, I guess, did improve as well. Ace 10 was already beating us. King 10 was already beating us on the turn, you know, so I don't think there's much reason for us to bet. If we did bet, it would definitely just be a block sizing here. It would be, you know, something in the region of this 2.67 just to kind of eke out a tiny bit of extra value from 9s or 8s or something like that. But I think we're just going to come with the check. And yeah, it is pure check with this hand. With our range, we do have some 50, 75, mostly 75, I guess. With this specific hand, it's just pure check. There's not really any reason to ever bet this hand here. Our betting range on this river is mostly just going to be an ace for value, or, you know, some low pocket pairs and some other hands as some bluffs. So I think we did okay with that one. Definitely a pretty awkward spot that players tend to not like being in, but we did do fine as far as how we played it. So we're now in basically the same spot, under the gun 7, pocket jacks, and now this time we actually get 3-bet by the low jack. So this is kind of an interesting one, because this is another one that I think players tend to have a bit of a struggle with. If you're one of those players out there who struggles with this spot, make sure you drop a like, make sure you subscribe to the channel. If you're not subscribed to Octopi yet, do drop a subscription there. We're going to put out plenty more video content for you guys coming soon. The response that we have against this low jack 3-bet, I think it's important to note, first of all, that the 4-bet options that we have really as a click back 4-bet or jam, because the 4-bet option here is very small, as a click back, we're going to kind of be forced into, really thinking very clearly about the types of hands that have the incentive to really want to get more action from the low jack, because we're not going to get a ton of folds against this really small 4-bet. And I think it's likely to be only really the very top of our range. So the kings and aces, maybe the ace-king suiteds, that are really going to have much incentive to 4-bet small here. I do think there's a decent chance that we have some jams. And this hand certainly could be a candidate for jamming here, given that the 60 big blind depth is one where we are going to 4-bet jam, at least at some, you know, reasonable rate here. The problem, though, is that it really comes down to, if we're going to jam with a hand like jacks here, it mostly will be in situations where we have the ability to get 10s or 9s to 3-bet call off, right? And in this formation, under the gun 7 versus low jack, I don't know how confident we can really be that 10s is going to call off. So I would imagine, I wouldn't be shocked if we're mixing some shoves here, but I think we're going to hit the call button. And let's see where we're at. Okay, wow, we're mixing all three. So we're definitely obviously never folding. we are mixing some shoves, and we are mixing a little bit of that click back in this scenario. You can see the hands that are preferring the click back size is basically just kings and aces. Ace king suited is mixing calls and click backs. We do obviously have plenty of calls. A lot of pocket pairs are calling, a lot of suited broadways. And we have a few jams, but it's exactly ace king off, queens, and jacks there that are jamming at some frequency here. So definitely a pretty ambiguous spot. And like I say, if we don't think our opponent is going to actually call off with tens, then it doesn't really make a ton of sense to do a lot of jamming with jacks or even with queens possibly. So I think that playing them through a call could be completely reasonable. Now, we do get a pretty dynamic flop texture. This is one where I think it's tempting to consider donking on this board, considering that we do have at least two of the sets in range. We don't have pocket threes in range, but we do have sixes, sevens, and we also have some 5-4 suited. So it's not out of the question here to donk. 7-6 suited is in there as well. I think I would prefer donking if it was like 8-7, 8-7-4, you know, maybe something like that, just slightly more favorable for us. I don't think it's out of the question here, but I do imagine this is probably high frequency check. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, we've got like tiny frequency of donking here. Not really a lot, mostly just checking. So playing range check is going to be fine here. And then villain bets the half pot size here. So villain does go with a slightly more chunky bet size. They're going with one that is going to deny a lot of equity to some of our overcards. They're going to put our strong ace highs in some tough spots. And in general, I think our response to this is going to be that a lot of our overpairs that maybe are strong but a bit more vulnerable, they're going to have a decent incentive to start growing the size of the pot here. Because at these low SPRs, it does become important not to get denied our equity. So it wouldn't shock me at all if the raise to 20 here is actually the right approach with jacks. And that's the one I'm going to go with. Let's see. Oh, mistake. Okay, 0.1% mistake. Slight mistake here. So it's a very slight mistake to raise small. The likely implication of that is that we probably are actually just jamming. Oh, it's a mistake to jam. 0% mistake to jam. Okay, so it's very, very marginal here. So we're just calling. Okay, that's really interesting. So we actually, okay. So we do have, all right, so I got a little bit screwed here. So we do jam with jacks sometimes. It's just we don't jam when we actually have this exact combo of jack of hearts, jack of clubs. So jamming is quite common with jack of hearts, jack of diamonds, or jack of hearts, jack of spades. And jamming with queens is happening quite a bit. So the main thing that I did get a bit wrong here is that we don't really do any of that small raise. We don't really do any of the clicking back. If we are gonna raise, it's gonna basically be a jam, just because of the nature of the texture. We're jamming some nut flush draws, just kind of this region of hands that's like vulnerable value and high equity draws, that sort of thing. So that does make sense. And then jacks, the combo that we actually have is just going to be. Ooh, why is that coming in? There we go. Okay, let's get rid of that. The exact combo that we have just prefers to call. Now, you might be wondering why a hand like jack of hearts, jack of clubs is going to play differently. It's going to be because of the blocker to the back door. So that's going to have an impact there, some card removal stuff. Welcome, sports fan. Thank you for the question. When you jam, what are you wanting to get called by? Worst hands, tens, some nines, some flush draws, some ace highs. If we go back to the sim here, I would suspect that versus the jam. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, villain is, if I unignore the weight here, villain's obviously calling basically any pocket pair, except for there's a little bit of mixing with nines here, but any pocket pair is going to pretty much be forced to call the jam. Ace king of hearts, obviously. Any ace 7 is going to call the jam. Any ace 5 of hearts, ace 4 of hearts. Yeah, basically just flush draws. Although even jack 10 of hearts is actually supposed to fold. That's quite interesting. But basically, yeah, overpairs, flush draws, stuff like that. The EVs are so close, Hostito says. Yeah, absolutely. EVs are very close together. A lot of these 3-bet spots are very, very difficult to, or 3-bet pot scenarios are very difficult to navigate for sure. So we do check call. We get a Queen of Hearts turn. So we do pick up a flush draw, but after check calling here, there's not really any reason to donk. So we're just going to check. It is pure check with range. We face a small bet, so we face quarter pot. And ultimately, I would be very surprised if we ever have any reason to do anything except just call here. Again, the check raise size is a little bit awkward. It's pretty tricky for us to raise without putting all of our stack in. I think we're just going to call. We do have some raises with certain portions of range, but not jacks, and it's a very narrow portion of range anyway. The river is a 4, so it does complete 4 to a straight, but it isn't a 4 to a straight that's going to be in anybody's range at a substantial rate here. Probably very marginally better for us compared to villain, but it's mostly just because we still have pocket 5s in range at a higher frequency. I don't think we have any reason to donk here. Oh, wow. Okay, so we do, that's really interesting. We do some donk jamming. This is a weird one. Let's take a look at this. So we are jamming sets. We have 6-5 in there. I forgot how much 6-5 we have there. It's a pretty decent portion of range here. We are jamming with, let's actually go equity and let's ignore weight. This should give us a bit more of an idea of where the different portions of our range are going to be in terms of value and bluffs. So this is, everything down here is the bluff portion basically. So we're bluffing with ace king off with a heart. We're bluffing with 9-8 suited that check called the turn. And we're bluffing, excuse me, we're bluffing with pocket 8s with a heart. So that's an interesting one. That's kind of a fun one. And then if we reset the zoom down here, the value region is basically going to be like this and up. So we've got, for value, we've got, obviously straights, set 30% of the time, tiny bit of overpair, tiny bit of flush, and even a tiny shred of top pair like ace queen with the ace of hearts. But basically straights and sets are strong enough here to actually jam this river for value. So that's really surprising. This is definitely an output that I would not have guessed would play out this way. If we look at the region of hands that we're pure checking or heavy frequency checking, this one's actually pretty straightforward because it's ace queen, jacks, 10s, and 9s. That's the stuff here that if we have these hands, these are just almost pure check. They have no reason to turn into bluffs. So we are just going to check this particular combo, but that is a really interesting output and one that I would not have predicted as far as overall the ability for us to have some donk jams. Now, we do face a shove, and this is where our decision becomes pretty tricky once again. And I think this is part of why I wanted to have you guys study some of these spots, because it's so common to get into these scenarios where we have a strong pre-flop hand that then turns into a bluff catcher post-flop, that it's important to have a good protocol in place for how we actually bluff catch. Excuse me. And what I mean by protocol is you want to have a systematic idea of how you kind of break down a situation and how you look at evaluating the properties of it. So Basketball Maven says fold. It could easily be a fold here, but I do think it is important that we first of all establish what's the value range or what's the value threshold for our opponent here. If they got to this point with hand of X strength or stronger, could they shove? And in this case, I think it's probably around an overpair, possibly ace queen with a heart. I think if they got here with those hands, I think they would probably feel like they can shove those hands, because the bulk of our range when we check this river is hands like jacks, 10s, 9s, stuff like that, right? So because we have a lot of hands like that, when they have queen X plus, they can probably shove for value. So first thing is that we don't beat any value. Pretty clearly, we don't beat value here. The second thing is, do we have good blocking power? Well, we actually do. We have a blocker to a flush, which is quite nice. And we do, well, I guess we don't really block anything else. We do actually maybe block a couple of bluffs, which is maybe not great. But basically, I think we're kind of neutral here in terms of our hand's ability to bluff catch. Sports fan, you're absolutely right. Having a heart does make it easier to call. It is certainly preferable to not having a heart. But I think what we also have to bear in mind here is that one thing about blockers that people get wrong a lot is that blockers are less relevant when your opponent's range is containing multiple different types of hands. So for example here, if it was the case that our opponent's range for shoving the river was only a flush or a bluff, then having a heart in our hand would be very meaningful. But because our opponent's range for shoving the river is not just a flush or a bluff, it's less powerful for us to have a heart in our hand. It may not be that relevant at all here, considering that they're shoving the river for value with a lot more than just a flush. So it is kind of good to have a flush card, but it's not super important. I would say this is probably just going to end up being a mix. I don't imagine it's going to be a pure call, but we are facing a fairly small shove. We're facing about 2/3 pot as a shove here. So I would be surprised if this hand is always folding, but I'd also be surprised if it's always calling. We're going to hit call and see what happens. Okay, so call is 2% mistake. Is it always? Oh, it is always folding. Okay, interesting. So this is kind of weird, right? Look at this. Jacks is the only hand in our range that's actually always folding. So again, I got kind of screwed by the output here. Tens, if we had tens, it would be exactly 56-44 as far as do we call or fold. So my assumption about jacks was that it would be doing this, that it would be mixing here. So I was right if we had tens. And if we had nines, I was also right. But with jacks, very specifically, we actually always fold. And I would imagine that has to do with the bluffing range that our opponent is going to have here. So if I was to look at what they're doing at this particular node of the tree, I would suspect that they're going to have some bluffs that have a jack in them, right? So if we look at, you got screwed, but it made for a better learning opportunity. Yeah, I did get kind of screwed, right? Yeah, so it did. Yeah, we absolutely we learn a bit better here. So blockers, we remove those two jacks there. It just kind of tells us what's going on with the range at that point. But as far as card matching goes, if I want to establish, how often is my opponent bluffing with hands that have these types of cards in them, well, there's quite a lot of bluffs in their range that also have the jack of hearts or the jack of clubs in there, right? They're not bluffing. Actually, it's not the jack of clubs that's bad. Ace jack with the ace of hearts, jack of clubs does bluff here, but you can see that we're blocking 3 combos of value. We're blocking this, these flush combos right here, but we're also blocking ace jack offsuit, which is a bluff there. Ace jack, the other offsuit, which is a bluff. Ace jack, king jack, king jack, king jack. So we're blocking basically 7 combos of bluffs and 3 combos of value. Sports fan, do you think people factor blockers too much into their decision making? Yes. If it has to be a yes or no answer, then I think yes would be the answer. But I also think that it's not about too much or not enough. It's about basically in the wrong spots, right? Like they're not considering when blockers are or aren't relevant. And then on top of that, they're also not considering what you would refer to as unblockers, or so I've heard people call them like reverse blockers or something, where you want to make sure that your hand does not contain certain specific cards, because if you bluff with certain cards in your hand, then you're actually blocking some of the folds, or you're bluff catching with a certain hand and you're actually blocking a bunch of bluffs. That I think is a part of the equation that people don't consider enough. And it's also, part of the reason why I say that they do consider blockers too much in certain spots is because there are a lot of situations where you might be blocking value, but you're also blocking bluffs at the same time. So it just kind of cancels out. And then there's also a lot of situations where, kind of like this one that I mentioned, where your opponent's range here is, if your opponent's range is not just flushes or bluffs, then having a blocker to a flush doesn't matter that much. And in fact, there's plenty of spots where if your opponent just takes a completely different line with, say, flushes or something, then blocking a flush would be completely irrelevant because your opponent never takes this line with a flush anyway. So you have to be aware of what you're blocking, and you have to kind of pay close attention there. So this one, next hand, we have ace-king offsuit. Cutoff opens. I think we're going to have a pretty reasonable 3-bet here. I think against some earlier position opens, we might mix some flats with ace-king off here, but don't think we need to do it against the cutoff. You can see ace-king off is pure 3-bet there, so nice and straightforward. And then we get flatted, and this is our flop, king 9-8. That's a really tricky flop here, and I think in particular there's a pretty meaningful aspect to monotone boards when we 3-bet out of the big blind, and it's because we are going to have some suited hands here. And you can see that, we'd have some of those middle suited card hands, but a lot of them interact with this board in terms of having an 8 or a 9 in them. And that means that we're not really going to have a lot of flushes here. And particularly, we don't really have any nut flushes or anything like that, except for ace queen. We have a certain amount of offsuit ace X and some other offsuit hands here, so we have some flush draws. But really, we're just quite polar in the big blind, obviously, where we have a lot of pocket pairs, and then we have a certain number of these sort of middle card suited hands that are a lot of our bluffs in this spot. So we don't really have a ton of very strong hands here. We also don't really have a ton of very weak hands. I think that probably puts us in a position where this board is either going to be I think this is probably going to be decent frequency of checking and then some small betting. I think I'm going to go small bet, but I'm not super confident about this one. Okay, yeah, pretty much kind of what I thought, actually. Looks like I did get this one pretty accurate. So we've got, range-wise, we're betting about 40% of the time, and we're kind of, small or medium can be okay. And hand-wise, it's actually very similar to what our range is doing. So that is, yeah, I think that's going to work out fine. Now, we bet small on the flop, which is obviously reasonable, and then the turn comes an 8. Now, we do have to consider here that, on the one hand, villain can obviously have an 8 sometimes, right? Villain can call pre-flop and then just call the flop with an 8. But on the other hand, there's really only a certain number of 8s that villain can have when they flat a 3-bet here. So we're not super concerned about the fact that this is an 8. Especially because if we did have some kind of a hand that was in good shape on the flop and then now is losing to an 8, like we had ace-king, which is exactly what we have, or if we had aces, something in those areas, we still are, because the SPR at this point is like 1.4-ish, we're basically just not going to be able to fold those hands very often here anyway. So we're not really super concerned about the fact that those hands now lose to an 8, because it's a low frequency thing. It's a pretty meaningful card in that sense, that it does improve some hands, but it's also not really going to cause us to suddenly get away from certain hands now. The thing that it does do is lower the equity of a lot of the potential drawing hands that might exist in the cutoff's range. So it lowers the equity of a lot of those pocket pairs that might have a diamond in them, straight draws, various other hands here are now worse off than they previously were. And it improves the equity of obviously any flush, but also any king X, those types of hands, those bluff catcher type regions. I think my inclination here is that a size that's going to make good sense is about this half pot region, because we're targeting hands like a 9, we're targeting a pocket pair like jacks, 10s, putting those hands in tough spots, and of course we are getting value from a king, and we're putting some of those straight draws and things like that in some tricky spots as well. So I'm inclined to go half pot, And yep, that is the right size. So we went with the half pot size. Works out pretty well. In fact, we're not really using any size other than half pot here. And looks like ace king is kind of just a mix there. Our bluffs here are going to be a lot of these straight draw type hands, but also some ace of diamonds type hands as well. Some single diamond hands in there. So definitely a tricky kind of a range to construct, but also a lot of it makes good sense. You know, we're checking a lot of queens, jacks, tens, etc. Checking a lot of 9x, a lot of pretty logical stuff in there. And then we get called and the river's a diamond. So these are the spots that everybody hates, right? This is, you know, you've got 4 to a flush out there. You've got all kinds of ways to lose this pot. And ultimately, it's true that this is a bad river. You know, there's no getting away from the fact that when the river brings 4 to a flush, our hand is now a lot weaker. But what we don't want to do is start kind of panicking and trying to, you know, go straight into something like, oh, let's turn this hand into a bluff, or let's try to figure out some sort of, way to win this pot without showdown, right? We don't want to take that sort of panic option here. We do just have plenty of ability to just play our hand in the way that makes sense according to our opponent's range. There is a possible straight out there, Basketball Maven, but it's very low frequency here. And the reason it's very low frequency is because 7-6 of diamonds already flopped a flush, obviously, and now it just made a straight flush. 7-6 of the other suits has a pretty close decision on the turn, if not a pretty likely fold in a lot of cases. So it's going to be very, very low frequency that we run into a straight here. The flush is much more common, specifically also because villain has some flushes that maybe they flopped a flush and they just called twice here. That is certainly going to happen sometimes. So we're much more concerned with the fact that it's a diamond than we are with the fact that it's a straight. But like I say, we don't need to push the panic button here and try to turn this hand into a bluff. We also don't really, I think, have any reason to use this block size of 15 here. I think we're just going to check. And yeah, this hand is pure check. We do have obviously some hands that shove, and a lot of it is just going to be good flushes, and then of course a few bluffs as well. But we don't have any reason to shove with ace king here. And then villain does shove themselves. So now once again we are in a position of bluff catching, and we also have to ask the same questions as we did before. We have the possibility of we have the necessity of figuring out what our opponent's value range actually is. And in this case, I think almost any flush that arrives at this point is definitely going to be able to shove the river for value. I think that the 8x hands that still exist are probably strong enough to shove for value. And I think any king is almost impossible that they could shove for value here. So I would imagine we're once again in this kind of position where we have a hand that beats all the bluffs, but does not beat any value. And considering that we have pretty bad blocking properties, we have no real interaction with any kind of portion of their range. We aren't blocking any bluffs, I guess, but we're also, I guess we are actually, we're blocking ace 8 of hearts, which could be in range, but they may just check back river with that. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm inclined to fold. I think we probably, yeah, this is 100% fold. If we look at where we're at with some other combos here, the calling range that we have, if I ignore the weight here, our calling range pretty much ends at, let's look at, this is all the stuff that's an obvious call, and then this is the stuff that's mixing. So like 10-8 offsuit, which is low frequency, queen 10 with the queen of diamonds, aces without a diamond is kind of close. So yeah, the ace king without a diamond, let's see, let's just look in terms of EV here. Ace king without a diamond, well, it's obviously folding, but the EV of calling would be, we'd be losing 1.2 big blinds. So, I mean, losing 1.2 big blinds in a pot of 120 big blinds is not actually that big of a loss. We're losing 1% of pot, right? So it wouldn't be a huge punt to call here by any means. But as you can see, even a straight here is just kind of a mix. So we don't really, have too much need to bluff catch with hands like that here. Now, I do want to quickly go back. I just didn't mean to click back there. I do want to see what villain's bluffs are supposed to be here. So if we look at villain's range, again, we're ignoring the weight here. So we're just going to isolate the value range first of all. The value range here you can see is 1% straight flush, 3% quads, 26% full house, and 70% flush. So in fact, okay, so I was a little bit off here in the sense that villain cannot jam the river for value with worse than a flush. They can't jam the river with an 8. If I reset the zoom here, oh, they actually, that's funny. They actually don't ever really have an 8 here. I guess they probably, maybe they're jamming the turn with all their 8x. Let's see what happens on the turn. Yeah, okay, so that's kind of what's going on. So they're never just calling an 8 on the turn. They're always jamming the turn when they have an 8 here. So they actually don't get to the river with any 8x hands at all. And that's kind of what's going on. So our villain's bluffing range here is this portion. You can see pocket jacks with no diamond, queens with no diamond. Those hands are turning into bluffs now. Quite interesting to see that. Jack 10 is obviously bluffing. And we actually do, that's kind of interesting. Villain is actually bluffing with a king sometimes here. They're taking hands like king, queen, and turning those into bluffs. So those hands do have some showdown value. They do have some equity, but they are also bluffing at a decent rate here. Equity-wise, let's see how much equity king, queen has. Oh, wow. Okay, so that's weird. That's really weird. So it looks like king, queen actually pretty much doesn't have any... What? That's... Yeah, I'm really surprised. Okay, so I guess what it is once we check the river... But then how can that be true, though? That must be a glitch here. There must be something going on that's not quite right there, because something like pocket aces... Oh, that's aces with the ace of diamonds. Okay, never mind. Equity... Yeah, king, queen of clubs, it says equity 0. But that doesn't really make a lot of sense here. Because we certainly have stuff like Jack 10 in our range when we check the river. So a king does win sometimes. So there's something going on with the equity readout here that might not be 100%. Like pocket 10s. See, this is what doesn't make... Oh, that's 10s with a diamond. 4s with a diamond. 7, 6, ace 9, 0% equity. It might be right. It might literally be that... Let's see, I gotta look at side by side now. I gotta really investigate this. So, when we check the river, right? When we check here, let's highlight the checking range. And let's see what is gonna make sense for us here. We're gonna go sort by equity. That's fine. Highlight the check, or... Yeah, there we go. So, we check... And then villain versus a check has... Oh, we're just loading the info right here. Yeah, okay. Oh wow, okay. So this is actually kind of showing it to us here, right? It's like... So that is actually accurate. Okay. I thought it was not accurate here, but it is actually accurate, because if you look at our range, ace king ace king is the exact bottom of our checking range on the river. We are actually never checking a hand worse than ace king here. The jack 10s that are checking there are actually the ones that have a flush. So in fact, everything worse than ace king is always bluffing this river in our spot, which means that when we actually do check the river, a hand like king queen just never wins. When villain has king queen, they cannot win unless they bluff, which is exactly why king queen is mixing some bluffs here. So we kind of solved that one. It took a minute. Took a minute to figure it out, but that's why king queen has no equity when check 2 on this river. So good takeaway there from this one is simply that when we are on a board like this, we do have to reach quite aggressively for bluffs. And especially if we're the in-position player here, we have to be aware that there are very, very few hands in the in-position player's range that can serve effectively as bluffs. So you saw them turning hands like queens, jacks, king, queen, etc. into bluffs here. And when that's happening, it's a very tricky situation to navigate. It does mean, we're still going to be folding ace king, but I think it's just really useful to kind of understand that we're not going to have too many easy bluffs to find, so we have to find some difficult ones. Hostito, seeing how you use this software is so useful. Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm glad that this is valuable. I'm glad that you guys are starting to get to grips with how to navigate the software. And I'm glad that it functions well as a way for you guys to, to take something away from these sessions and be able to go and study spots yourself when you do the exercises. So with that in mind, I think that's actually a good spot to wrap it for today. We got through a few really good hands, really interesting spots. And this is the beginning of this month's, practice session or practice schedule, I guess, when it comes to focusing on playing the top of our range. So we're going to continue adding more challenges as we go through the next few weeks. And then when we come into next month, when we come into the last block of challenges for 2025, we're going to move on to a new topic. And by that point, I believe we are on course to have a lot of big upgrades made to the trainer functionality here on Octopi. So we're going to be able to do all kinds of useful new stuff with the trainer, and I'm looking forward to being able to help you guys implement that as best as possible. So thank you everybody for tuning in. Appreciate you guys being here, and I will see you all at the same time next week. Good luck in the meantime. Before you leave, don't forget to drop a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. So thank you everybody, and I will see you soon. Bye-bye.